And
But that's a funny thing, though. The idea of American history and how these days we have this sort of revisionist, these revisionists who are going after American history to paint it as being totally negative.
mhm,
It actually doesn't only apply to the United States, but to the continents, both North and South America.
mhm,
That history lessons today, even in elementary school classrooms, are not what we grew up with, and we aren't that old.
mhm,
But the history lessons today, it's basically the demonization of Europeans,
mhm,
and there's blame laid on the Europeans for the illnesses that they allegedly brought over from Europe to North America. But if we examine that both historically and biologically, let's consider the fact that the Indians on both continents had failed at the domestication of any animals. And so, well, they didn't have many animals to domesticate in the first place, but the ones that they did have here, they failed to domesticate. So they did not have the same exposure to animals that Europeans did. That is the same regular exposure that permitted the Europeans to develop this sort of passive resistance to pathogens,
yeah,
which, when they were introduced to the Indians, wiped out whatever they say, like 90% of the population in a decade
which was
on
not
both
the fault
continents.
of the settlers at all, except for that one time when the Englishmen actually did give smallpox pamphlets. But that was just like
But that was hundreds of years
that
later,
was
and not
hundreds of
only that,
years later.
this is the first 10 years of European presence in the Americas, and
Hmm.
before the majority of these people had ever even laid eyes on a white man,
Hmm.
these people were already dropping like flies, and that's by no fault of their own. But at the same time, to lay blame on the Europeans for introducing progress to these people,
Hmm.
and that's totally ignoring the ideological backward state that they lived in,
Yeah,
that they were really unable to make any real
I mean,
advancements in civilization. They
there
were
is a
warlike people.
they were very warlike, and I think that that may actually have a reason to play into like why they were wiped out so quickly is because, maybe they didn't really have great hygienic practices. Maybe they didn't really understand that their form of sexuality was basically the exact same as animals. There wasn't really much to it other than that. The reason why property was passed down matriarchically is because, for the most part, most of the men did not know what their fathers were or who their fathers were. And
Hmm.
so it was, and that's just like one part of why they were called savages. That's just one of the reasons. Um, and so when the Europeans came here, a lot of what they did with the Indians was just educating them and civilizing them. And I'm not saying that in any sort of facetious way. I'm just saying, just straight up, there was no civilization here. There was the Aztecs, and they were already on the decline. They were basically like that. It was sort of the end for them.
Hmm.
Um, and they saw, the Europeans as like saviors. So, and then there was the Inca. And, well, the Inca had just gotten over like an extremely bloody civil war. But other than those two civilizations, there really wasn't much else in the Americas that you could say was a civilization. There were the mound builders, but they were all dead because they were all wiped out by other Native American tribes. So, all of this just goes to show that, the what is being taught in schools is nothing short of brainwashing of American children. And Pat Buchanan was complaining about this in 2001, but it's like gotten so much worse now.
Well, one thing that modern academia neglects is the existence of God. So here's the thing. Here's what happened, like between like 1492 and 1775, especially in South America, more so because North America wasn't exactly evangelized properly until later. But the thing is, it was divine providence that the Indian empires fell because they were engaging in like the worship of Moloch and like human sacrifice,
Hmm.
and that's kind of cringe. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So basically, when you look at like when modern academics look at like a large volume of people dying, they say there has to be something responsible for this, something that like isn't right.
Hmm.
Whereas when like a Christian would look at this, they'd see that it was basically divine providence because these people weren't really good people to begin with, you know, and they were properly evangelized, and
Hmm.
then they you know
Yeah,
they
well,
became.
I would dispute that somewhat. I would say that the Canadians did pretty good at evangelizing their natives, but
You mean the
the
French?
French, yes, the French Canadians. I'm not talking about anyone from Ontario.
No, and that's another funny thing though. That if you want to talk general Canadian evangelization practices, the go to in that situation, I guess, most people, I suppose they do think initially of the French missionaries, the Jesuits, and all of that. But when you look at the Anglican missions in Canada, that came much later on when they finally decided to acknowledge that the American Indians were in fact human.
Mm-hmm.
The goal of that missionary endeavor was to totally destroy what little identity remained after colonization. This isn't to say that colonization is a bad thing, because that is not so. There are infinite reasons why colonization is actually good, despite what people believe today.
Mm-hmm.
And we've gone over a few of them just now. But when we, the Catholics, would enter into a foreign land with the hopes of converting those people, we would go for their hearts before we went for their necks.
Mm-hmm.
And the Protestants, they played the other way around. I don't think that they're quite the same as the Muslims as far as their efforts at conversion go, but they were nowhere near as peaceable as we were.
Mm-hmm.
But we also had a decent idea of enculturation and things like that. And enculturation, not for the sake of acknowledging the superiority of other cultures. So this enculturation, it wasn't for the sake of integrating their customs into what we already had, but rather adapting what we have so that it would be easier for them to understand. For example, like in China, the fact that the priest throughout the whole mass wears a hat. That's unheard of in the West.
Mm-hmm.
But for the Chinese, that was a reverent custom.
Yeah.
So that was used in their liturgy. In North America, where the French had evangelized, the propers of the Mass had been adapted into the languages used by the American Indians, like Mohawk, so
Mm-hmm.
that they would understand, like the introit and the sung parts of the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
So there were efforts made by the Catholics to appeal to these people and to preserve aspects of their identity without without preserving the negative things, like the fact that there was absolutely no moral hygiene, the fact that there was no sense of right or wrong, the fact that they viewed human sacrifice as being perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, this is very different from yesterday's show. Yesterday's show was just a bunch of jokes. Well, okay. The first half of yesterday's show was essentially just Traybar and the Jared from Subway, and it was just those two arguing over the what do you call it?
Over the SSPX.
That's what it was, the SSPX, and it lasted for a really long time, and I don't want to talk about it anymore because like it's just I'm
Good.
done. I'm done. Like we talked
Yeah,
for
cool guy.
every single moment we talked about it, it was just like I was trying to direct it to something else, and then Traber was like, "Oh, let's just derail the conversation again."
How many times we gotta tell you, retard? The SSPX
No,
ordinances.
stop. Okay. Anyways, that was and then the rest of it was basically Jared from Subway about Black Lives Matter, and yeah, he was sort of giving some of the same talking points you were giving, except his was more sort of lukewarm. He didn't really. And I think the main reason is because he sort of cares a lot less about politics and a lot more about religion. And so that's what he focuses more on. And he's young. That's the other thing.
Well, religion should certainly take precedence over politics, but at the same time, our political views should be fully formed
Yeah, that's
by
what I
our
mean.
religious opinion. Integralism is the way to go.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is that his views were not fully formed. They were sort of half formed because he was like
How many
Black Lives Matter is
times
a
do we gotta
Marxist
tell you this
organization,
week?
and I sort of tried to refute that, and I was like, well, how exactly would it be a Marxist organization? Because they don't care at all for like poor white people, and he had no way of like countering that. So
Let's say the reason for that is because their conceptualization of white class warfare is basically the same as Marx's, except in the sense that like all white people, because you have the concept of like white privilege. So
The
you have this you have
whites
this
are the bourgeois.
hmm
whites are the bourgeois, all of them.
Cletus
It
is
doesn't
the
it doesn't
bourgeois.
matter. It doesn't matter because all of them inherently have an advantage over blacks according to them. So they're
hmm
basically just the bourgeoisie,
Yeah,
So for the
like
first
I
time in
said.
80 years, the Muslims have held prayer services at Hagia Sophia.
yeah, that's interesting.
Well, as Malcolm X used to say, watermelon and Kool-Aid. Where the white women at?
All right, as long as you didn't say the N word, we're gonna keep that in there.
Anyways, what about Muslims?
Yeah, so they're still using they're gonna be using the Hagia Sophia for prayer services, which I don't know what's my opinion on this is basically like, well, it was being used as a museum, uh, which isn't that much better, honestly. But, I don't like the idea of Muslim prayer services being held either. But I can't say that, like, I care too much more. I don't know. What do you guys think about this?
Well, that's the interesting thing because, like, what is it? Muslim prayer services as opposed to what? Either it being a museum or it being turned over to the Patriarchate, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople.
hmm
That's not going to happen under the Turks. And having read these articles written by supposed Christian
hmm
journalists in American magazine, there was that guy who wrote the piece where he said that Hagia Sophia should be both a mosque and a church.
Oh,
Now,
really?
frankly, it is my opinion that this is not our battle to fight. We are Catholics, and
hmm
this, while it was once a Catholic cathedral, was stolen and effectively deconsecrated by heretical schismatics.
hmm
And we seem to have lost sight of that in the modern era, the post Vatican II age, that the Orthodox are schismatics. They're no one to be dealt with. But anyway, so this idea that Hagia Sophia should serve both purposes as a church and a mosque, and that we should extend that line of thinking to churches like the Cathedral of Cordoba in Spain,
hmm
which, of course, was once a church built by the Visigoths in Spain.
hmm
Then, when Spain was conquered by the Moors, they transformed it into a mosque,
hmm
and upon Reconquista, it was changed back to a church. Now, the idea that in our reclaimed territory, we should share it with our former conquerors, who
hmm
we expelled from the continent, or rather, who we expelled from the peninsula because
hmm
they were already in the continent again at that point. Um,
Yeah.
it's really absurd. It's really absurd that people think this way, but it's a result of Vatican II and this modern notion of false ecumenism.
hmm Definitely. And I mean, I don't know if it would be, it is a result of Vatican II, but we had a really long conversation about Vatican II yesterday, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here. But that's not how Vatican II should be interpreted. Vatican II should be interpreted as completely in line with church teaching, just with, different language to suit the modern age. And that was
Well,
what it
here's
should
the
have
thing.
been, but it
Saying
hasn't.
that saying that like the Hagia Sophia should be used as both a Christian church and like an Islamic mosque is like saying that the colonoscopy room at the hospital should also be the orthodontist office. You know what I'm saying? Are you catching up what I'm putting down?
I'm catching up what you're putting down. It's like saying that the ancient, you know, the ancient German Catholicism should also be shared with like the old Puritans of like, Anglo-Saxon England, which is kind of what happened in, you know, like the old days, but like in the 1500s and stuff in England, it was like you had these radical Puritans and these Catholics in the same church at one point until, the Catholics got persecuted and the Puritans said this isn't actually pure enough for us, so they went their own way. But it's like, you're right, basically, it's like two ends of the same corpus, I guess. You know what I mean?
Well,
I
to,
actually
to
have
my
no idea
knowledge,
what you mean.
though, there actually are churches in Germany in Reformed territory that are more or less shared between Catholics and Protestants. It sounds very bizarre, but
Hmm.
when we look at this holistically, in comparison to the idea of a church serving a dual purpose as both a church, a temple for divine worship, and a mosque,